buffet. The food's pretty good here. We have to say that's one of the reasons we come to this venue. So we move to the afternoon sessions, and I think that you've heard the themes from the keynotes. Carbon, sustainability, it's all linked. We need to make sure that we get our heads around this and we develop our understanding of it and our carbon literacy massively. I think carbon literacy really is a issue not just for our industry but for society generally, and nourishing and nurturing that process I think is really important. So today we are going to be looking at, and I can't see the exact thing, but carbon and financial risk in the built environment. And this is a little bit of a launch pad, I guess, for CARIS, which is a BRE initiative, so obviously the Building Research Establishment, looking at how we approach carbon and how it might influence investment decisions as well as design and everything else. We've got a great tech panel. We have Ed from the BRE, we have Tom from Roundhill Capital, who are kind of very active in trying to understand these issues, and of course Mike Ward from Ruckus, who really represents the end of the market about gathering that data and presenting it in a usable form. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Ed to do a presentation, and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A afterwards, and also Q&A with the audience. If anyone wants to ask any questions, please put your hand up and we'll respond.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Brendan, and thanks for the opportunity of joining this fantastic UKA event. So yes, my name's Ed Sunday, I work for BRE, Building Research Establishment, and we're talking about carbon financial risk. But yes, we do have an opportunity as well to look at a particular initiative around real estate portfolio carbon risk. And it's fantastic that really this has already been on the agenda today. Ian's presentation, talking about whole life costs, talked about embodied and operational carbon. So I don't really need to refresh why that's so important. Built environment, massively significant in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Residential sector, hugely important in terms of the built environment, dominating the built environment in the UK. Yet there's a bit of a lack of visibility or high level visibility around operational and embodied carbon. Ian also mentioned, but I've actually got a couple of examples here where we know sustainable buildings actually have higher values and they have higher rental returns, between 3 and 18%, depending where we're operating. And that's whether the building is BREEAM certified, which is part of my side of the business, or whether it's a LEED certification across the pond in America. So sustainable buildings are valuable. And if we step back from sustainability, behind sustainability is a lot of talk around carbon, around operational energy and operational carbon, and around embodied carbon, that carbon that goes into making and constructing that building in the first place. We've had quite a lot of conversations around the metrics and the benchmarks, and that operational energy metric, around kilowatt hours per metre square for buildings, is becoming quite a common conversant factor across other sectors. I was quite interested to see that some of the data reported earlier was in square feet, so maybe we need to think about a bit of an alignment there. But that's a really important operational energy metric that can be converted then into operational carbon through established conversion factors. I see Ian's in the audience, which is fantastic. That's great news. And then the second one is embodied carbon, which is all about that embedded, the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per metre squared to deliver a metre squared of your building. So all the way it's put together. Benchmarks can be quite confusing. They're often trajectories. So what's on screen here are the RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge. So that does have a residential table, which is great. So it's thought about the asset class, but as we know, residential is a really, really broad church. So actually the targets are extremely useful. They've got really good background data to them. So we're quite keen on showcasing things like that and then using them as part of this journey for CARIS. So CARIS is a proof of concept that's been funded through Innovate UK. We are, I think that went through automatically. Innovate UK, we've been working with a whole bunch of stakeholders from the investor, lender and operational community, focusing on basically enabling better decision making. So critical to an existing building is if you know nothing about its operation and embodied carbon, but you're thinking about making interventions to improve it. well, what's that intervention going to do for me? If I put solar PV on it, if I upgrade the insulation of that building, what's it going to do for me in terms of improving that carbon profile? So we're testing this prototype at the moment, and we've got 4 groups of user personas that we're working with. So sustainability analysts in lender organisations, investment managers, mortgage advisors, and building owners and building managers themselves, coming at it from quite different perspectives. But the need is very, very clear, and that connection to de-risking asset investment has also come through quite clear. So in terms of some of the concepts that we've looked at, we've obviously looked at operational carbon measures. We've got EPC, it is what it is, we know that. There are a whole bunch of other things that we're looking at around SAP and SBEM, which are also part of BRE's activity. We've looked a lot at improvement interventions, as I said, heat, power and fabric. There's some very good data about the embodied carbon associated with those things and the operational improvements they can deliver for particular archetypes of buildings. How those can be aggregated, we've looked at issues around circular economy, so that very point that Ian made for his building in Glasgow, where they had to do the assessment about whether they should leave some of it standing or just demolish it and start from new. That connects into what we know as the circular economy. We've got to look at existing data, so we've been instrumental in setting up something called the Built Environment Carbon Database, which is an open access data source for entities and products in the world of construction. That will get populated, hopefully in 10 years' time it will be so overpopulated that it will issue its own benchmarks coming from that for different asset classes. And then we've sought classification as an outcome, this concept around a risk score. So this just sort of steps you very briefly through, and sorry the formatting's gone a bit wrong here, the tool itself. So the landing page selects into the particular user persona. At first landing from open access data, you can get a pretty rough idea of what your operational and embodied carbon is already, and we can commute that into a risk score. So that's your very high level first landing. However, you're probably more interested in looking at mapping and regional variations, and then getting down into the particular individual asset classes themselves and individual assets. What data is already available for those? Can I upload my own data to improve that process and improve and refine that outcome? You then can align that with chosen benchmarks. So we've just got on the screen there the trajectory associated with the REBA residential targets. You can then compare and contrast what it's all about. Look at business as usual. Look at your different assets in your portfolio, see those that are performing perhaps less well in terms of operational and embodied carbon, and then the critical bit, step into a zone where you start making interventions. And that intervention is a whole range of different things, but you'll be able to see the direct impact of making that intervention on your particular asset. And then outputting that data. I mean, that can be just reported out or open data sources. We're quite interested as well about how it can pre-populate disclosure mechanisms like CREM and so on, so that you don't have to do the work all over again, but also critically how you can link in your own data. Of course, I would flag something like BREEAM use, for instance. If you've got that certificate for your building, there's a whole bunch of data in there that a digital platform of BREEAM can help support. So this may well become in future part of that end process where it looks specifically at risk. And then the final slide, really, just thinking about this topic we've got in front of us today. As Brendan says, we need to be carbon conversant. I think there's a lot of value in everybody just understanding the basics around carbon. We, as an organisation, want to bring visibility to that for portfolio and asset. It's definitely needed from the people we speak to. And there's quite a significant gap. So interventions are great. I want to improve this building. But actually, what will I get in return for that? What impact will that have on that building? And perhaps not just in carbon terms, but actually, translating that into occupant bills and so on. But I suppose part of our conversation today might pivot around, well, what do I need to measure? How do I measure it? Where might I get the data from, for instance, for this? And then how can I sort of plug those gaps, really? So where we start now, and where we need to step forward to get on this train. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ian. It's a fascinating scope of of potential work in the sense of where we're going to draw information from carbon, relevant information, and bring it together and aggregate it or analyze it. One of the things that concerns me about all of this is the language that we use. So when I speak to investors and lenders, they're very, very concerned about this issue, but they don't have necessarily always the technical understanding that goes into a lot of those computations. Now, I know it's early days on Caris and there's a long way to go, but if I put my architect's hats on, I could get into that space and I can have a technical conversation and understand more or less where things go. If I put my UKA hats on, I need a simpler language. I need to know that this is going to give me stuff that is relevant and important, and I don't need to have a degree in engineering or architecture to get there. There's a few dark arts sometimes in these things. So I have there's two parts. I want to get the investor's view, but can you give us a little bit of a comment on how we standardize, how we simplify carbon conversations? And because for it to really take hold, we need our audience, the wide audience of participants, to be able to engage with it in a very meaningful way. Where are you guys on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. Carbon literacy, carbon conversant, whatever we want to call it. We can go to lots of different sources and find differing responses and answers. I think I come back to those kind of two fundamental metrics that are now broadly accepted within the benchmark arena, within RIBA, within RICS, within the World Green Building Council and so on. So that operational and that embodied. Behind all that, you're quite right, the architects typically are the real enthusiasts in this space because they can see the impact of the efficiency. They can see the specification of different materials resulting in different and lower embodied carbon. So I think fundamentally those are the two things. We've done some work with, and it's quite interesting because policy, the conversations we've had so far today around policy and the sort of slight lack of direction, shall we say, in many respects, that fundamentally translates across everything. We did a piece of work with a very major county council. A lot of their councillors had just changed, so they had this whole bunch of new people within the housing and development remit that the levels of understanding about these issues was all over the place. So just having a basic net zero fundamentals, if you like, proposition, which could be something, BTR is not my world, but maybe that's something UKA could look at doing. So let's get a fundamentals level that actually resonates in the language that the audience understands.
Action point one, it seems. Tom, you're an investor, you're in built to rent, you understand you understand what's important, what you have to, or how you'd like to report on carbon. What would you like to see from this? You can see there's lots of clever maths and computation, but you're an investor, you have to make really, really tough decisions or very, very complex decisions. What do you want to see? How do you want to see this functioning?
I think it's the transparency of data, and I think one of the interesting things you touched on is the sort of cause and effect of I do X and it means Y, and I think there are various things you can achieve in terms of ESG, but BREEAM very good, BREEAM excellent. You don't just sort of achieve that and think that's good enough, I'll go home, that's the end. And different investors will have different targets. What's acceptable to one is not necessarily to another. But I think we need to have a very clear idea as to what we're trying to achieve and that transparency of how you're going to get there. And asset level, rather than buying carbon credits that sort of builds trees in another country, what is me putting photovoltaics or ground source heat pumps or whatever that asset level, real tangible improvement will do to the actual really operational side of the carbon efficiency.
So I mean, really in a lot of ways you're looking for an interventionist tool that allows you in a more sort of keyhole surgery sense to this is where we go, this is what we target, this is what we put in there, rather than open surgery just to see what happens when we get in there.
Yeah.
That makes a bunch of sense, and the accuracy that's perhaps coming with this, I think, is vital to not just our understanding, but the ability to advance and push the momentum on this. But you know, on another level, we know what we want, but how do we get it, Mike? I'm looking at you now. Ruckus is in buildings doing all sorts of things. How do you fit into this?
So Ruckus themselves were fundamentally kind of a wireless vendor that was originally providing kind of managed service Wi-Fi via partners like Glide, Hyperoptic, these type of people. And as an overlay for that now, the network itself will allow us to operate an IoT network along the same physical network itself. So the IoT sensors will provide you guys with that kind of real-time data, bolster the data sets so you can make decisions on intervention. Investment by its very nature, you're happy to spend the money, but it has to be, you know, a quantifiable return.
Targeted and
Yes.
useful, yeah.
So effectively, we're bolstering the data set by kind of pulling the real-time information, monitoring power usage, water usage. We can monitor CO2, damper mold, whatever the physical agenda is, we can capture that and push it across the network, present it into a single pane of glass, which allows you guys to make an intelligent decision, investment.
So what that's really saying is in the development brief or even in the investments requirements, the massive censoring of the building, you know, the ability to capture this information is now critical to the success not just of Caris but to our journey to net zero. And that, you know, I think design teams around the world kind of get that, but I'm not sure that they get it enough or that there's enough monitoring or enough data collection within buildings, but I guess there's a way to go on that. But one of the things that I hear a lot of in this journey of understanding carbon and ESG and all the rest of it is that we'll just start somewhere, just start measuring. But and as helpful as that is, as a rallying call that we do need to start measuring our buildings, it's like just get on and measure. The next question is, well, what should I measure? And if I start with these ones, what's the next one? How do I intelligently and methodically build a database of measurements? So where should we start? Ed, that's up to you.
Yeah, I think, well, in a way, to me, this answer sounds a little bit obvious, but it is around the operational energy side. So fundamentally, we've been talking a little bit about a carbon risk score here. That is still dominated by operational energy, operational carbon at this point. There is a factor around embodied carbon, there is a factor around your ability to intervene and make a difference, because building typology will say yes or no to a certain extent. So that, and actually at the development side, you've got that ability to say, right, from square one, we can build in the right sort of monitoring and metering aspects that will need to fully demonstrate the performance of this. So in a sense, validating the design brief that modelled it, that tells you how it will perform.
Yeah, to some extent, you know, capturing energy use and that sort of thing it's fairly obvious. But where do we go from here? What's the next step after that? There's one of the things that's coming through other work that we do is it's behaviour that needs to change as much as design and technology.
Yeah.
And how will you see us advance this data capture to include things like behaviour and use patterns and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. So, and as we know, one of the big weaknesses, many of them, one of the weaknesses in EPC is you can have two EPC equivalent rated properties, but one of them is operated completely differently from the others. Windows only, heating on, etc., etc. So, yeah, the occupant bit is absolutely critical. And therein lies, you know, as organisations that are interested in operation and have duty to residents and occupants, there's ability there to get them as part of the crew, as it were, almost, in terms of how they manage that building. So behavioural change, yeah, that is part of it. So that's about demonstrating the benefits to them as individuals. That could be around, it could be to do with the sort of the rental terms. So we've seen quite a push in Wales in the last few years around green mortgages, for instance. So where owners are able to intervene and improve their buildings, they're incentivised to do that by getting a much better rate on their remaining mortgage from their existing lender. So, you know, it's mechanisms like that.
So, I mean, you seem to be suggesting if you're good old green kind of activist and you lower your consumption, you could argue for a discount in your rent. I mean, that's kind of, you know, it all comes back to the money. I mean, from an investment perspective, how do you see investors using a tool like this? I mean, that's perhaps a little bit of a flippant point, but I guess it would be quite a motivator as well. But how would you use this level of carbon analysis within not just your investment side, but on the operational side?
Yeah, so we operate as well as we're investors, asset managers, developers, but we own all our operational companies, so it's a constant feedback loop. We're also sort of heavily invested in the student sector. I think there's a number of things we've learned from that in terms of bills are typically all inclusive, and you can't have a student putting their heat on 30 degrees and then leaving with the window open. So there's boost buttons. I'm not suggesting that the build-to-rent market transitions to treating sort of adults a little bit more like students, but you cannot sort of there has to be a sort of fair usage policy, and we have to understand how people are actually using the buildings. And I think just general monitoring, having the data, I think does change attitudes. I think there was someone that installed a water meter. Just the fact of having a water meter that had the polar bear sort of slowly reduce and the ice cap melt meant that there was a 30% reduction in water usage. I mean, that's just the knowledge of, I've used it for a certain amount of time, maybe I should stop having my shower now. It had a meaningful cause and effect sort of impact, and I think it's having that transparent data, and then from the operators we can inform the specification and what we're going to put in and how we're going to adopt new technology into new buildings or retrofitting existing.
Okay, so I mean, sort of, Mike, you'll be to some extent needing to interact upwardly towards the investors and the BRE in terms of data, but also downward towards the consumer, the customer, the occupant. We all hopefully carry smartphones now and can. So how do you see that working from your side? You're going to be providing real-time data on the one hand of what they're doing, but you could also be a huge influencer in this process as well. How do you see your role in this regard?
It is just that data capture and potentially setting a threshold, because if we have a good data set, then you know what is a good tenant, what is a student perhaps who's leaving the heating on, going out, whatever. So it's an education piece, but without that physical kind of benchmark threshold, do you know who is misbehaving, who's good? Back to Ed's point, the building could have an identical EPC rating to another, but if that building has a group of residents that are not particularly green, then that building's not performing as well. So it all comes back to that data.
So it seems to me, if I kind of slightly simplify this and pick a leaf out of Ian's book as well, is that I'm not going to say we have the technical solutions, but we're moving towards having better technical solutions that will give us good design solutions and good data that can be captured from that. We can intervene to existing buildings to some extent. This is really a new building gig, although most of our buildings are already existing, and I'm sure there's a way to retrofit this stuff. I had a conversation with the Green Property Alliance, which is an organisation of all the bodies, institutional bodies, all the industry bodies coming together to try and collaborate. And it struck me that the thing that was missing from all of them was the consumer. They were terribly focused on the asset, terribly focused on the technology, but not focused on the consumer and how the consumer can be part of this. And I think if we look at the circular economy and some of the things that we presented earlier today, the role of the occupants is so important, and we saw in the Building Safety Act as well. So this integration piece of everybody who's involved, everybody recognise they have some responsibility, is perhaps the paradigm shift or the cultural shift which is occurring. But it comes back to money, doesn't it? It comes back to how much does it cost me and what is my return? So can we, as we sort of get to the end of this, can we kind of get back to some of those fundamentals? Because if Tom's going to invest and he's going to put the capital in to do all this stuff, which my sense is most investors are willing to do that, but they need this word that keeps coming back. They need certainty that what they're putting in is going to return something. Are we there yet?
I think it was interesting what David Reed said in terms of sustainability, having a positive impact on profitability down the line. I think it's completely true, and I think whether you want to or not, and different investors will have different targets. Some will go higher than others in terms of what they want to achieve. But if you take a sort of if you're only going to achieve an EPC, there will be a two-tier market where institutional investors just won't buy that stock. And someone else will, but I think there will be a two-tier market in terms of this is investable to pension funds and institutional investors that have to tick and want to tick that ESG box, and then there'll be everything else.
So let's just, I mean, I think that two-tierness is already happening. Some of the big players are just selling off their dirty stock effectively, so they don't have to. And move towards that. Where do we go from here? Because in time, you know, Part L is going to change, and regulation is coming fast. That will force asset performance, improved asset performance. Where do we go then? What's the future for investors? Will they? What's the additionality? How do we see that shaping up?
I mean, I think some of the investor lender groups that we've spoken to. Obviously, UK has the oldest housing stock in Europe. It's got an immensely challenging profile of different archetypes. Many of those fall into categories that are determined as hard to treat or difficult to treat, i.e. to improve the performance of those buildings. And I get concerned about that, because those are often buildings that link into cultural heritage, so somehow they have to be supported. We value them somehow for some things, but not others. It's rather curious. But the central piece is around that we're interested in. Actually, it's not about creating new data, although live data is really, really important. We don't have that at the moment. It's how we can use that existing data to bring visibility to that, so that somebody could look at a particular building, they could future of that asset.
I mean, this sounds to me like the industrial policy that is not there needs to be there in terms
Well,
of integrating all of this stuff, because unless we join these things up, we're not going to get the results we want. But I don't mean to put you on the spot again, Tom, but at the end of the day, you know, the role of money in I believe the capital markets will deliver net zero way ahead of any government. How do you see us progressing if we just use EPCs from C to B to A to what's after A?
I don't think there is currently a very clear benchmark that does what it needs to, and I don't think EPC is the answer, particularly for the operational side of things. So it has to be the operational monitoring, and how do we get to carbon neutral, carbon negative, and it has to be understood so that day one you know that you're going to get there, and if you're going to hold this building for 10 years, you know, you build something you know has the sort of M&E systems and everything else that is going to be efficient, so that even if people do sort of treat a few units perhaps not optimally, I think you still achieve a sort of certain level which is acceptable to you within some sort of benchmark. And I don't think EPC is necessarily that right benchmark.
I completely agree with that, but at least it's something that's understood. We'll go to the floor in a moment, a few questions. I'll just ask Mike one more time. So you can see how this is going to grow. From your side of being in the building, collecting data on it, do you see any problems for your end of the market where you're having to, you know, how do you see you improving your infrastructure to do this kind of stuff?
Our infrastructure as it sits will support any standards-based kind of IoT monitoring. So go back to the previous point, no matter what the agenda is, whether it be a social housing landlord that wants to monitor mold and damp, whether it's someone like yourself that wants to look at carbon efficiency, that network will sit within the building and be able to pull that data in a single pane of glass. So obviously things will mature and things will improve. As it sits today, we can pretty much monitor any network.
Yes, okay, well that's good to know that at least one part of
Says
the industry is
confidently.
completely ready for the future. Any questions from the floor? Sorry, there's a mic coming. You can just say who you are.
Graham Stark from David Phillips. Tom, you mentioned the importance of asset level considerations when you're investing and building. We're a supplier to the sector. What's your message to the supply chain around how we need to support you on that journey? We have ESG at the heart of what we do strategically. Clearly, we want to understand what your message to us would be to help you get to where you want to get to.
I think it's just understanding the importance of ESG to you and how you source and manufacture furniture. Where does it come from? What's that journey? Are the people that are making it well looked after? And you can sort of tell the story of that life cycle really. And I think it is important. We put recycled yogurt pot tables into our student and build to rent, and that's a story. The recycled tyres and there's gym flooring, and it costs more, but you can tell people you've done that, and people appreciate it, and they will actively choose your building versus another that doesn't necessarily have that. So I think it's telling the story, and if you as a manufacturer and provider care about it, then I think that just sort of goes down the chain.
Brilliant, thank you.
Anybody else?
Keith Davis, Bureau 4. Probably a sort of split question for Tom and Ed. We seem to be talking an awful lot about operational energy and performance and the value that brings potentially on rentability, on rent values. Our energy supply is getting greener and greener, and it seems to me as an industry perspective, we need to focus on embodied carbon potentially more than we're currently focusing on embodied carbon. And I suppose there's two parts to this question. For you, Tom, is there an inherent value on rentability and rental values of informing the customer base of how well we've done with our embodied carbon when creating the product in the first place? And then, Ed, from your perspective, is there a simple way of almost scoring embodied carbon? Because there are going to be buildings out there that have been really well thought through and developed in regards to embodied carbon. From Bureau 4's perspective, we're involved in a few of those, but it's not that obvious from the outside looking in of all the effort that's been put in. So I think it's two questions, maybe Tom. Is there a value there? And then second, is there a way that we can do better at shouting out about embodied carbon?
Yes, I definitely think there's a value there. I think if you took two buildings side by side and one was greener than the other, then I think tenants would naturally choose that. How much of a premium would they pay versus the other? I think depends on the person, depends on the market. But I definitely, we have seen that tenants will actively choose a more sustainable building, particularly if that story is sort of well communicated. I think it's also educating build to rent, co-living versus PRS, and the overall benefits of well managed professional occupier and the story behind why it's greener and more efficient than everything else.
As that carbon literacy grows in the general public. But to answer the point directly, so for buildings it's really interesting. So 20 years ago the focus was almost entirely on materials, embodied carbon. Do I choose timber over steel or whatever it might be for my structure? There are several different bits of software out there where you can do whole building life cycle analysis now based on the same methodology, thank God. So there is an underpinning consistency there. It's called the impact methodology. We were part of the team that helped develop it a few years ago. So that is a way of doing it, of presenting that whole building embodied carbon data.
I think the narrative piece here is we heard in build to rent, our narrative is not good. The carbon narrative is even perhaps further behind. Not about that the boffins are involved in it all the time, but in terms of the consumer side of that, a simple scoring device about that, I think, is something that would help everybody. We're coming to the end of this now. We have to have our 3 action points. So as the moderator, I'm going to ask each of you to come up with one or as many as you'd like. Ed.
Well, that word literacy again, so I come back to what I said earlier. I think it's not a sector I fully understand, so I think UKA has this opportunity and role to present carbon literacy to the BTR audience, to get that up to that common language. I was really interested to hear about the BTR qualifications, for instance. That's great, and maybe it's part of that.
Put that to it.
we sort of discussed here, maybe it's a sort of live EPC type product that truly understands the operational efficiency on an ongoing basis and provides a constant feedback loop, which is transparency of data, and smart meters will get better and better and we'll understand more and get smarter, but it's a constantly evolving process to become better.
I think just urge people just to be efficient and obviously look at kind of monitoring techniques to produce these data sets that allow these guys to make the decisions, I guess.
It's a behavioural change amongst the effectively the
Ultimately,
consumer.
the consumer, the people, the building can be as good as you like, but if it's
Yeah.
down to us as occupants to be responsible, I guess.
So the education piece around that. Well, it's been a fantastic gallop through this really important issue. Carbon is going to, the carbon debate and the carbon challenge is going to be with us now forever. Thank you to my panel for demystifying some of it, also giving us hope that there are solutions coming forward, but also that the investment market is actually behind this. This is not about not wanting to do it. There's a certainty required.
Steve. It is when you're in your 50s, it ain't when you're 5.
Don't tell my son that.
Back together.
Good. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this session regarding risk. We heard a lot about things like the Building Safety Act this morning, and that concerns partly about risk, and we're going to explore that in more detail here. But what this session is really asked about is managing risk throughout the property life cycle. And our preposition is the risk is present throughout the whole development and operation of build to rent. What are the real key challenges and how are operators mitigating against them? And what we've got into the panel, which covers a broad range of the sector. We have Tim Reed from MPC, everyone will introduce themselves separately. We have Catherine Rose from Verve Life. We have Dominic Lyon from AJ Gallagher's and Peter Clark from ARC Consultancy. So if I could ask each of you to do a very brief introduction of what your view on risk across the property life cycle looks like, and then we'll get into questions.
Yeah, no problem, Graham. So just to build on what Graham was saying, my role at NHBC is to have our overall work in alternative residential, but also I think I've got quite a unique role in the sense that I also manage our top 50 builder relationships on the private sales side. So you guys in the room are a bit of the flavour of the month for them at the moment in terms of some of the bulk deals that we're seeing. I think for us the main message as NHBC, which is where we're known for dealing with those volume house builders, is a definite message to build to rent folks like yourselves, and I think that's around long-term asset protection. And very much there the focus, and if you look at, I don't know about you guys, but I certainly struggle to get here in the storm, and what we see through data is that with storms comes water ingress, and I think it hammers home to build it right first time. So I think it's absolutely vital that ourselves as an insurer who has skin in the game work with the builder who also has skin in the game. And two distinct groups for me. Number one is that either the people we're dealing with are long-term asset holders, so they are taking a 30-year view, so building it right is really important. Or the second thing is they're taking a shorter-term view and they want to trade assets, and we've started to see build to rent trading on assets. And so building it right first time for those guys is also important because they want to retain or enhance their sales value. So I think that's the fact and the detail, and the I guess some examples that I can turn to in terms of what we're doing as NHBC is we've announced recent partnerships with Related Argent and Multifamily Sigma in single family. But the conversations we're having is very much about building it right first time, and we've launched something called Quality Common Scoring, where on a scale of 1 to 6 on our inspections, a 4 is compliant, but we've extended our inspection service to look at what achieves a 5 and a 6. And so what we're trying to do with those build-to-rent developers and investors is to demonstrate beyond compliance how they have assets that are future-proof. I think that's the key message, is about future-proofing assets and working hand in hand around risk and insurance to protect those assets, so that we protect the investor developers' yield and their value, and we protect ourselves from a risk perspective in insurance.
Thank you, Tim. Catherine.
Hi, so I'm Catherine Rose, I'm Managing Director and co-founder of Verve Life. We talk about build it right, we're going to talk about managing it right, operate it right, and design it right. So we get involved at super early stages, helping clients get planning, looking at the design, looking at the viability, the feasibility, what the unit mix should be, what the amenity offering should be, and we're working across single family housing, co-living and multifamily built to rent. Ultimately the end game for us is the management, so we want to make sure that we can reduce that net operating income, maximise the rents, reduce the risk, and have a product that then we can mobilise and let, and we then run efficiently.
Thank you. This morning we heard a lot about the Building Safety Act. Peter, I know you're heavily involved with that. Maybe could you just give an introduction about your work in that and your views on the impact of building regulation?
Of course, yeah. So Peter Clark, Executive Director at Art Workplace Risk. As Graham says, we're very heavily involved in the Building Safety Act at the moment. Full disclosure, I think Art Workplace Risk predominantly work with property management companies and developers for in-use buildings. So what we've found, we've been on a learning curve, and we are working now with developers at all stages of the development. So very interesting for us. With risk management experts. So we see different risks now, which is very interesting for us, a diverse range of risks. I think one of the things that I would say about the Building Safety Act, it was great to have Tim Gower here earlier on from the regulator. I think it's a real privilege that the regulator comes out to these events and talks to us, and I think we've really benefited from that. Particularly at ARC, we're working very closely with the regulator and have been for a number of years. The biggest impact, I think, on the kind of the design and the construction of buildings is the impact much further upstream. So you kind of got to get it right first time. I think we were just talking about that. That kind of, you get it right first time. The benefits down the line for that building. Now BTR is really, as we mentioned in the keynote this morning, BTR is really at the forefront of this. You're building buildings to last. So what the government is trying to do with the Building Safety Act falls right into your hands. This shouldn't be necessarily difficult or send you on different paths. Think about changes. Think about change management. It's a huge section of the Building Safety Act. How good are we at change management? How good do we need to be at change management? And by that I mean, if we think about construction in the past and the history of the buildings that we are working with today, those changes that may seem trivial, if we go back to where this all started at Grenfell, those changes have played a critical role in that tragedy. Those changes of materials at the last minute, those changes of construction methods at the last minute. So the Act looks at change in a very different way than we ever have done before. I guess one of the controversial sound bites that I would leave you is that the Building Safety Act is the enemy of the flexibility that you once knew as developers. So that flexibility has gone. You need to get things right first time. And I think that's an important part going forward. I think you're going to need to you're going to need to also be educated. We had a great session earlier on with Joe Green about the training. We need to be educated. We need to make those decisions about what are material changes, what will affect the fire safety and structural safety of buildings. Will changing the colour of the tiles in the bathroom affect that? Probably not. But what about carpet? What about wall coverings? It's a minefield, and I would strongly say that training and education is going to be a huge part of this.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to certainly pick up on some of those themes during the discussion. Finally, definitely not least, Dominic, broader insurer view, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Thanks for having me, everyone. Always a pleasure as an insurance man to be invited to the main panel, because I know that it's not everyone's favourite conversation topic. So, Dominic Lyon, Director of Gallagher's Insurance Real Estate Team in London. For what it's worth, I've declared my colours right now as well. I'm also on the board of the Structural Timber Association, so I'm a bit of a timber nerd, and I also advise on the other side of the fence on the TD UK advisory board as well, so I've got sort of a moonlighting hat in the world of timber, but all with the goal of getting us to net zero, not because I've got shares in timber companies. From an insurance perspective, I think, first of all, I want to insure anything that you guys are talking about there, because that's all music to my ears. With the risk of kind of using Grenfell, the tragedy that it was, for the wrong reasons, but that had a massive knock-on implication in my world as well, in the sense of our industry, to be blunt about it, hadn't really kept pace with what your industry had been building for the last 10, 15 years. We'd stopped asking questions. Insurance had got too cheap, it was too easy, and we had not kept pace with what was happening in the built environment. And Grenfell was a stark awakening as to what our buildings had been made of and how they'd been made, and perhaps how, where we'd been promised quality, that hadn't actually been delivered when they'd been value engineered heavily. So I'd say that kind of the key overarching theme in my industry now is an exercise in rebuilding trust in the built environment again, post Grenfell. And frankly, how do you do that? It's not rocket science, it's communication. It's engaging insurers and realising that we are people, we're not so scary and horrible if you talk to us. All we really want is to know what you're up to be brought along as part of the team at whatever stage of insurance we're talking about there. So don't think about us 3 minutes before you need the insurance, think about us 3 months maybe, and tell us what you're up to and engage with us, and perhaps even take on board some feedback we might provide, because again, we're nice people really, and we like to feel like we're adding value.
And you're our best friends when it all goes wrong.
Well, absolutely, so we're a necessary evil. Whether you like it or not. So.
I would support what Dominic says around early stage engagement, so we would get it nervous if it was 3 months actually, but we would prefer 3 years, so one of the things that we're trying to do
baby steps,
is to, I guess for us, because we've got, if I get back to my public affairs PR days in the former life, we talk about brand equity, so we think there's a good brand equity, if you follow that within NHBC. But with that is a more premium product. We're not going to be the cheapest, so we don't want to have a bit similar to what you were saying, Dominic. We don't have a transactional relationship with a builder that doesn't have an alignment of values and quality, because we underwrite our own business. So if we take on business at the front end and take a fee, which costs us millions further down the line, it's completely a false economy and doesn't go back to our public good. So I think for us it's really important to understand, rather than a piecemeal approach to one side, is to meet with that development or technical director and really understand what does the development pipeline look like. Big conversation, I'm sure we'll come on to it, is around contractor solvency and quality. How can we support that? Can we provide contractor insolvency? And through our data, not through opinion, but through our claims data, can we help our developers to build it right first time and design our claims at the front end from REPA design stage 3 rather than much further down the line?
Yeah, I was going to ask Tim what good risk management from a design and construction point of view looks like. And you touched there on the risks involved. Can you just do this a bit more on contractor insolvency piece? Because that's a big risk that you're starting to see more of.
And I'm sure we'll come on to MMC as well, which who's going to go to their board at the moment and tell their board they want to use an MMC contractor, particularly on a volumetric space. It's going to be quite challenging, isn't it? So what we try and do on contractors, because clearly there's a lot of nervousness around contractors, particularly those that are not tier 1 contractors and not house builders, is what we try and understand with the developer on that 3-year program in advance is which contractors are they going to use, and what can we say without breaking sensitivities around A, their solvency, and B, their quality. And we would offer up to 10% of the contract value, but it's dependent on a couple of factors. Number one is their balance sheet, it's hand to mouth, which might be, particularly as an SME, then we're making a calculated bet like this isn't going to go wrong, so we can't guarantee we'll offer it, which is a challenge. And number two is our exposure to that contractor within the group. But again, I think it comes back to what both Dominic and I are saying, which is engage early, because if we know who the contractor is versus we've got a partnership with as we do with Related Argent or Sigma or others, they come to us and say, hey guys, we've employed this contractor, and we're not comfortable with that contractor for some reason, because it chops it off at the front end. So I think understanding that and then supporting them in advance. I do think it gives a competitive advantage to tier 1s and some of the bulk deals we're doing from house builders, because if you're a build-to-rent developer, you can imagine that if you're going to a big listed house builder or you're going to a tier 1 contractor who may not want your work, quite frankly, but you imagine that they're not going to go bust, whereas you go to a perfectly good SME, it's a real challenge because you might see the risk spectrum moving towards that.
So just taking that on forward more predominantly from the broader insurance point of view, how if you've got a contractor can't get insolvency cover from an NHBC, how would you view that?
Not brilliantly, you might not be surprised to know. I suppose the simplest thing, and the thing I used to spend a few years trying to sell before I moved into real estate insurance specifically, was all around taking control of risk on the developer side. So I used to work with a lot of universities, a lot of large developers doing significant size projects all over the UK and Europe. And there's always a decent rationale for leaving risk with the contractor, because it sometimes feels easier and feels cleaner and feels cheaper as well, which is often not the case, but they like to buy things in prelims. But the reality is that I think the way that the world is going, developers are realising that they have to take a bit more control of risk than they ever have done before, in the recognition that the risks are sadly increasing as a general statement rather than decreasing. And what that means in practice is if you're developing something of a reasonable size, yes, ultimately getting a credit type cover to protect you in the event of your contractor being bust is quite challenging. But even if it's just that you end up taking out the development insurance rather than the contractor, at least should the worst happen and your contractor goes bust, your policy doesn't go with them. You've got a policy, it is fairly straightforward to continue. I mean, that policy that unit's been paid for remains live, and then it's a case of talking to your insurer and going, look, this has happened, we've secured the site, we're going to replace it with someone else, can you change the name on the piece of paper, and on we go. And it is almost that simple. Whereas, if it's the other way around, then you have to go into conversations around, okay, we've got no cover at all anymore, but we've also then got loads of contractual issues around warranties that no one else is going to want to pick up, so can we get them placed in the insurance market? It becomes a whole minefield.
And very briefly, I would say one of the biggest challenges as well is we will work with the client to onboard the new contractor, but the new contractor's taking on the liability of what inheriting that site, being prepared to take the liability is a real challenge for them. So pricing wise for the developer, you can imagine the contractor will charge significantly more if they are prepared to take on the liability, and we then need to be comfortable with the insurers for that.
And we have operational issues. If we're taking on warranties or contractors that have gone bust, we need to maintain that equipment in line with the warranties and in line with the service agreements. And for us, that's really complicated. And I think there's a huge play in terms of, we touched on it briefly, in terms of whether you're what's your strategy? Are you in this as a developer? Are you in it for the long term, short term? The clients, are you holding it for 30 years? That life cycle, that risk, and that early stage of procurement, making sure you've got your right contractor base, I think is critical for then the long term ongoing operational management of the scheme.
Yeah, I mean, the point's been made there before by Peter about how build-to-rent is there for the long term. So everything we talk about is identifying those risks, mitigating and managing the way through. Catherine, also coming more onto the operational side, what does good risk management look like from an operations point of view?
That's a good question. So I sound like a bit like an air hostess, but our on-site teams are there predominantly for the safety and for looking after the building. And I think the on-site teams or the centralised team, depending on how we structured it, have got a really big job because they are pulled to lease up to do rents, but actually health and safety falls the top of our agenda at every meeting that we hold with our clients and internally. So we're heavily reliant on a good supply chain, good handover, good O&Ms, good documentation, good platforms for us, and good consultants such as Like Art to ensure that we are managing those buildings in line with mitigating risk, maintaining things to reduce future costs and life cycle. So there are so many challenges involved with reducing that. Absolutely, it's not an easy job for property managers.
And do your investment backers have views in particular about what they're looking at from a risk management point of view?
How the rents are going is normally more top of the investment list, I'm not going to lie. And health and safety is very much our job, but with the Building Safety Act, the onus is on the building owners to be the responsible people, and actually I think that's really brought it into focus that property managers have a huge role to play, but actually as building owners, the buck does stop with you. So they are embracing and understanding more about risk and life cycle and health and safety and compliance.
Thank you. Switching a bit back to build out on Peter's points of view there about the Building Safety Act and what implications that's got on insurance, insurability and then broader risk. Do you want to give a bit more detail about that side of things?
Yeah, I think where I said earlier on that the building safety is probably the enemy of flexibility and variance in construction, which I think is quite right, for the right reason. It's the friend, isn't it, of the insurer now, and it's certainly the friend of the investor potentially as well, because whilst it's worth stressing as well that this isn't a one-off exercise. This is, the Building Safety Act is there for the long term. We're talking about life cycle of building really from a drawing, a hole in the ground to dispose of that building is a very long time, which again is why Big TR is very well placed, and particularly owner operators, you've got an investment in that building as an asset. So to build it correctly, to future-proof it is huge. So I think from an insurance perspective, we could be getting towards a stage where those risks, as we see, and those operational risks, those financial risks, those investment risks, actually come down. Because if we're doing this properly, if we embrace the Building Safety Act and we do it properly, and we want it. So one of the things that Tim Galloway said earlier on, and I think kind of went under the radar, but it struck a chord with me, because we've been trying to talk to our clients about this for a long time, is about management systems. And it's not about a bunch of documents, it's not about gathering data, that's part of it, but it's about the life cycle of that building. It's about that kind of do once repeat, that cadence, that flywheel, that this becomes part of normal business as usual when you're operating a building, when you're managing those buildings. So I think its impact will be positive, generally. Now, obviously, I'm from a safety background, and safety is what I do, so that's always going to be the primary. That's the primary reason this legislation came into being. But there's a lot of benefits here. There's a lot of benefits for those end users, for those residents as well.
I was speaking to a head of underwriting last night about that very topic, and his view was that from a risk perspective, I can maybe agree with you that it was better. Why wouldn't it be? But what we're seeing at Coalface is we're writing less business because we're getting clients going back on second staircases. So we've got 2 in London at the moment. I had a call the other day from the Build to Rent developer in Manchester. They've been operating the asset for 5 years. And they were looking at retrofitting a second staircase into a built asset. And then as a final example, we're working slightly outside of the PTR with the Housing Association, who historically has done what we call major projects above 18 metres, 7 stories. And they're building 6 stories, so they're building less homes. So it means for us as an insurer, whilst our risk might be reduced, we're making less premium because we're potentially writing less properties that are being held up. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. We de-risk, but we make less.
If I may, to oversimplify things that I like to do, insurance makes money in the grey, if we're brutally honest about it. If things become very black and white, then things are much more easier to quantify. And I think the Building Safety Act is a move in the right direction of embracing golden thread, embracing data to ultimately drive quality and safety, which we're not enemies of at all. We're actually massive supporters of. I think we're 5 or 10 years away in my sector from properly embracing the use of data when it comes to the environment, assuming you guys get there too. And it will totally change the underwriting landscape, because if we have black and white information that we've never had before around what a building is made of, I know it sounds silly, but we really don't have that in most cases. It'd be a game changer.
It's incredibly hard actually in the Building Safety Act, where we've inherited buildings which are 6 or 7 years old, to try and get that information for our clients to be able to register them is incredibly painful. New builds is really easy, we're embedding that process into our onboarding system. So I think it's the legacy buildings and it's those legacy buildings that don't have the second staircases, and how's that going to play out in the future from a risk and a life cycle perspective. And we've got clients who are also considering putting second external staircases in.
But do you think it will impact on valuation? Because there's a bit of obviously LinkedIn and weekend.
On another panel debating this, and it's a slippery slope if it does, and how do you value it clearly? But I know that the valuers at all sorts and Savills have got a view, so I think it is playing a part in the valuation sector, from what I'm hearing in the industry.
Thank you. That's certainly the first part of that. Heard a lot about their insurance issues, warranty issues, Building Safety Act implications. Before we move on to another question here, is there anyone got any questions to the panel around those things we've just talked about? Please.
Somebody's got a question.
Know any friend?
Thanks. Robert Kennedy, Owen Mitchell. One of the things you were talking about is probably aimed more at the insurers, is that you were all talking about a contractor. One of the things I'm sort of seeing more anecdotally is that, and again this was alluded to, that the way this is going, sort of minimising risk, is sort of skewed in favour to the tier 1 contractors. So many contractors who haven't got those balance sheets are being put off. And there's more and more talk at the moment of going down construction management procurement routes rather than D&B. And I think my personal view is actually that's going to happen more and more because you can front load your design and you can save on the construction costs later because you're not paying the D&B premium. But how is the insurance market sort of geared up to that? Because traditionally, not just insurers and also funders don't really want to touch it unless you've got a big track record and you're a British landlord who's been doing it for years. So how does the sort of insurance market or the rest of the panel sort of see that? Because that seems to be a developer risk mitigation mechanism they can take themselves.
That would start, this is sort of, so for context, I moved out of our construction team in early 2020, but I did a couple of schemes on the down the CM route before that. I would say it was not as big an issue as perhaps you suggest it was, in the sense of it all comes down to track records to a point, and if insurers want to get themselves comfortable with the fact that there is knowledge and quality within the team as a whole, and it's something I hammer on about in the space of timber and MMC is that even if your principal designer, by their own admission, has not run loads of schemes in that space or with that material before, as long as they're honest enough to admit it and say, and that's why we're working with a third-party consultant to peer review or whatever it may be, to get everyone comfortable with the overall quality, that's all the insurer really wants to hear. It takes a little bit more explaining, yes, but I think everyone knows that D&B is completely flawed and has been ever since its inception, in the way that risk is just thrown down the chain and the little man loses. I like the construction management route, and I think there's a positive spin on it as well as the challenging side. In terms of pure, can I get risks placed if they're going down the construction management route? Absolutely, I don't think it's a challenge. There are some slightly different questions to be asked at a slightly different time, but it's not as big an issue as perhaps it might be perceived to be.
Yeah, I think for me, Robert, I'd probably get you a fuller response from our underwriting team if you would just give me your email and get you the people that are dealing with us on a day-to-day level. Just to be clear, even if we don't offer contractual insolvency, we would often place the warranty, but then there's clearly a risk there for all the people that are involved. You're quite right, it does end up. The wider environment favours those that have got stronger balance sheets, because we're making a calculated bet that contractors are going to become insolvent at some stage. Anything that we can do to de-risk it is a positive thing, but I'm probably better off getting you a formal response from our university if you want to give me your email at the end.
I guess if that main contractor does go bust, you can still enter into the subcontractor contracts with the subcontractors, which only one of our clients has done. So would that not mitigate that risk?
That's what one of my clients has done as well.
We would look for a solution to try and it's a bit like playing golf. You get I don't know the version, so I don't mind using it, but you hit the ball into the rough and you just try and get out of the rough and try and get back on track. So we would try and work on that basis, but our physical legal contract would be with the contractor placing the cover, and the developer would be the beneficiary. And that's the great thing about the policy is, in our world anyway, the developer, the investor, is the beneficiary of the policy for that 60-year design life.
I know that, if I may just come back, sorry, I know things are sort of changing a little bit in the landscape, but I think most of my industry recognises that a lot of the tier ones have almost been operating like construction managers for the last 20 years anyway. And they're basically just a shell, and then everything goes to subbies. So it's sort of like contractual, yes, the contract's different, but the reality is quite similar in terms of how they're going to deliver packages.
But also, I think if you're a developer, a lot of our tier 1 client contractors operate at a minimum level of value. So unless you're building some massive block with hundreds of millions of pounds, you might be, whether you like it or not, be forced down to a smaller contractor on lower scale projects.
So the debate's, you're an easy panel, by the way. You just talking amongst yourselves. Fantastic conversation.
Yes.
You've answered all the questions. We were going to talk about MMC, and you just touched upon it there, Dominic. Tim, could you just one very short answer on MMC? Is that a risk going forward? How do you, from an ESG point of view, investors seeing it, MMC as a very important element of future development and sustainability and timber. But there's been a lot of negative press, obviously, regarding recent modular manufacturers having problems. Is MMC a broader risk, or are there elements of the MMC that we should be promoting as beneficial?
I'll try and give a brief answer. So Lord Kerslake, who was a good friend of mine, HBC, described MMC, I thought, a good description of the dog that never barks, which I thought was interesting. And then you couple that with the market where you've seen the withdrawal of LNG, really patient capital, you've seen Urban Splash, you've seen Elkey clearly recently. And so, to my point earlier, you'd be quite a confident development technical director goes to your board saying you're going to look at an MMC contractor. I think it depends on what your definition of MMC is. So the government defined these 7 categories, which many of you may know. And I think where we're seeing the challenges of the risk is around the volumetric category 1 sector. But if you actually look at lots of our volume house builder clients, they are requiring timber frame factory certificate category 2. So I do think it depends on your definition of NMC, but I certainly think there's a lot of challenges for volumetric. We have something called NHB6 Sets, which certifies NMC systems for a 60-year design life. We certify ILKI, but we can't control the solvency. So I think the solution, to my mind, is you need a regulator, you need a guarantor to step in and provide the confidence, the financing, that if the contractor is to go bust, we're not better off with solvency, but they'll support them more broadly.
We are coming towards the end of time now. As is the mode with all of our sessions today, we're looking for actions to come out of the sessions. I've heard a number of areas that you've thrown at me, like need to educate the market, build trust in construction again, the absolute paramount importance of early engagement in every respect. What would you say were the key learning and action outputs that we should be taking from this? Catherine, maybe I'll start with you.
You're really throwing me in the deep end on this
All right,
one.
then I'll start with Dominic.
Sorry, I was a last minute stand into this panel, so I haven't joined any of the pre-calls. So to throw that
I am really
quite
sorry.
rude.
I'm going to take that back.
Give me a minute.
Take a minute. Okay. I think I'm going to echo a few of the things I've heard throughout the day. It's been a fantastic day today. It's been a real eye-opener, and the messages are wonderful. And this sector is the place to be, I think, at the moment. So what I would take away from that is education. I think training and education. There's a couple of fantastic courses, which you all should have been on, in my opinion. And I think, along with training, it's that don't delay that get involved. Make sure your buildings, make sure that golden thread of information is sound. That golden thread, the vigour of your golden thread information is more than just safety. It is quality, it's sustainability, it's the life cycle of your building. So embrace and own that. And I would say lead the way. You know, I think the BCR sector is in a prime position to lead the way and inspire the rest of the industry.
I've got one now. I'm not going to go last because these two might steal it. I think it's, don't forget the operators. I think about how you're going to operate that building and what your strategy is, and don't forget the downstream operation, making sure that the operators are involved in that design to mitigate that risk in that life cycle.
So that's an early engagement of the operator as well.
Absolutely.
Chair, who's next? I'll go next.
Dominic's going to do his thing at the end.
He's going to finish with a massive percent. So 3 things for me. Number 1, engage early. Number 2, understand your contractor. And number 3, which I haven't really touched on too much today, is from the point of land acquisition through to completion, is really manage that development process and benchmark that performance through things like third parties, inspection data, so you get under the skin of it. And I think it's a particular challenge when bulk sales are going on in build-to-rent volume house builders, because there's lots of build-to-rent folk inheriting homes that they haven't been able to get under the skin of in terms of the quality, and there's a different proposition there if you're looking to take a 30-year view versus driving a share price.
Lots of good stuff said, I won't repeat, but for me the one that wasn't perhaps fully picked up was quality of communication. So insurers don't know what they don't know, and I know that sounds a bit silly, but they're still trying to, as a crude statement, learn, catch up with what's going on in the environment. Also, they have at any given point 10 quotes on the desk. If you communicate better and you give them better quality information than the other 9 people that are trying to push them to work with them, you're going to get a better response and you're going to get a better service from your insurer. So recognise that they're under pressure, and the better you come to them and the more prepared and with better quality information, the better you're going to get.
Do we need to educate insurers better?
Absolutely, yeah, including me. But yes.
That's fine, I've got the education piece in it. Thank you. Thank you for your attention and participation.